Hi, I'm here to talk to you about AWS Amplify today. AWS Amplify is a set of tools and services that enables mobile and front-end web developers to build secure, scalable, full-stack applications, all powered by AWS. My name is Gerard Sands, and I'm a developer advocate for Amplify. Today, I'm going to show you how to create an app using a GraphQL API to store and retrieve your favorite restaurants in a cloud database using Amplify. Let me pick Vue. And we are seeing the getting started for Vue. We can see the different pieces that make the Amplify framework. We have the Amplify CLI, Amplify libraries, and Amplify UI components. Before we start building our app, I want you to make sure you have all the prerequisites. This will be a good time to create an AWS account if you don't have one. We have a video with instructions, and you can also follow the manual instructions here. You just need to go to our documentation website and follow the getting started. So once you have followed all these instructions, you will be ready to build this tutorial. Before we do that, let's go and see a demo of what we are going to build. So what we can see is a login page. So one thing that I want to do is I want to create a user, as this is the first time that I'm using this app. So we can use the link there, create user, and I'm just going to create a new user. So I received this code in an email and I can use it. So let me confirm. So here we can see that there's one restaurant that we can see. Here we can also enter any other restaurants. We have this form to create new restaurants. We can also refresh this UI. And that's pretty much it. Another thing that I want to demonstrate later in this tutorial is how we implemented real-time features. So in this case, if you share this application with different users, they can all see the changes as they add or remove new restaurants. So that's also a cool feature that we can implement using Amplify. Let's go ahead and start creating the app. The first step that I want to show you is just making sure that we have the latest version of the Vue CLI. Next thing, we are gonna create our app using Vue Create. We are gonna pick Vue 2 using Vue and ESLint, and we are gonna pick Yarn. So this has a scaffold, all the files that we are gonna need to build our Vue app, and I'm just gonna check that everything is working, and we are gonna run yarn serve. So at this point, you should have followed the video and also the manual instructions to set up a new project and make sure that you have all the prerequisites. And what we are going to do now is initialize our project. And I'm going to run Amplify init, and we are going to be going through some instructions. So the first one is the name of the application, and I'm going to use Amplify app. As the environment, we are going to pick dep. Amplify has picked up on Visual Studio, so we're going to pick that. The next question is what environment we're going to be using. So we're going to use JavaScript. There's also Android and iOS. And it also has picked on Vue. Because this is a Vue project, it has already selected Vue. as our JavaScript project. So let's go ahead. We don't need to change this, so that's the source directory and also the distribution path. So we will keep those, and also the build and start command. So that's going to create our backend environment. Now we want to pick the AWS profile. So I'm going to go ahead and pick that option. And I have different AWS profiles in my machine, but you should be able to pick the default in your case for this tutorial. So pick the default, and that will link this application with your AWS account. So after we have finished this step, we will have a new folder in our project with all the configuration for our front end and back end. So the next thing that we are going to be adding is authentication. To add authentication, we just need to run this command, amplify add auth. So the current provider is Amazon Cognito, and we are going to use the default configuration. For this question, we are going to pick the username, and we don't want to change any of the advanced settings. Okay, so now that we are done, we can go ahead and run amplify push. So this command will create and provision all of the resources in order to run this new authentication. So let's go ahead and run amplify push. We can see the resources. We just have an auth resource, and we just created it. So yeah, I want to go ahead. First thing I want to do is add the dependencies. So let's run this command, and it will add AWS Amplify, which has access to all of the categories you may need, and also the UI for Vue, which contains the UI components. So let's run this command. Let's do the changes to our project so we can use authentication. Let's bring the main.js, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a few imports. So the first one is the import for Amplify. So that will bring Amplify instance, so we can use any of the categories. In our case, we want to use the authentication. We also import the UI components for Vue, and then we have the AWS exports, which is the configuration that links this project with your AWS account. Next thing that I want to do is change our app component, and here we have a simple setup, and I'm gonna start adding some new controls, and the control I want to focus is the Amplify Authenticator, and I'm gonna use this code snippet to display a welcome message. So that will show the username, and that will also display an Amplify sign out control. So we can use this code snippet just to change the initial setup for your Vue application. The next thing we're going to do is add the imports, so we can gather the information from the user, and we need these two imports, auth state and on auth UI state change. So that will provide us the information from the user. I'm going to add the user to our state, returning object containing that user property. So next thing is I'm gonna call this on Auth UI state change, and this is a callback that we will be running for every change on the authentication state. And we are going to get the state and the user information, and for us we are going to check that we are on a sign-in state. That means that the user has already entered the login details and is about to use the application. So at that time we're going to set the user information in our user state, so then we can show it in our welcome message. So at this point, if you run the app, you will have the full authentication flow, so you can create new users, you can also log in, log out, see the welcome message. So that's all there is to it. So now we can go ahead and create our GraphQL API. And I'm gonna run the same command we run with authentication, but now using API. The first question is what kind of API we want to create. So I'm going to create a GraphQL API. You can also create REST APIs using Amplifier. So the actual API name, I'm going to use Restaurant API. We're going to use API key as the default authorization. We're going to leave this empty. And we are going to expire this API after 7 days. That's the default option. And we don't want to configure any advanced settings. We also don't have any existing GraphQL schema that we want to use or import. And for this example, for this tutorial, we're going to use a single object with fields. So let's go ahead and pick this option. So now we have a template using a to-do schema, and let's go ahead and change that. So let's replace the current schema with the restaurant. So this will be our restaurant type, and we can see that we have few fields. We have an ID, we have a name, a description, and a city. All of these fields are mandatory. We are using the exclamation, and you maybe have also noticed this add model. So add model is a transform that will indicate to Amplify to bind this type with a DynamoDB table and create all of the resolvers in order to do all of the CRUD operations and also add some filters. So before we continue, let's run. So now we are ready to run Amplify push. And this is exactly as we did before. So now that we have add this category to our project, we are ready to set it on the backend. Here we can also see an overview. So we just created the API, so that's on a create state, and the auth is with no changes. So let's go ahead and continue. For this category, we are gonna want to generate the GraphQL API. So I'm gonna go ahead and generate the code, so we don't have to write this code ourselves. We're gonna use JavaScript, and we're gonna look for JavaScript files with queries to run our commands. And these are queries, mutations, and subscriptions. We want to create all of the operations, so I'm gonna pick yes. And this is to protect you from deep, dangerous queries. So we are gonna set a maximum of 2. You can also change this later. So as a result, we get a GraphQL endpoint and our GraphQL API key. So you may want to take note of this. And every time you want to access your GraphQL API endpoint, you can use this URL together with the API key. So now it will be a good time to show you another command, and this is Amplify Console API. So every time you want to open the console for GraphQL, so you can test new queries and maybe check what mutations you can use at any time, you can go ahead and run this command and it will open the console for you. So let's run this command and use the console to test our new GraphQL API. We want to see the GraphQL console, and that will open this console for us. So from here, we can run some queries. The first one that I want to run is this mutation, and this one will just create a new restaurant. Let's look at this query. So we'll start with the mutation, then we can pick a name, and then we have this create restaurant. So that's the definition, and that's taking an input that takes all the details of that restaurant. And then we can also pick the results that we can see here, and we want to shape the results by picking all these fields. We can also see the definition for each of the fields. And then another interesting thing from this UI is the documentation that we can find if we go to the right side. We can run searches, and we're going to look for this create restaurant. And we can see that it returns a restaurant type, and we can pass the arguments for create restaurant input. And this input type has been created for us. And we can see that it contains all the fields from our restaurant type. So let's go back to our mutation and create a new restaurant. Let me pick this mutation, and that will be the result. And as a result, we are going to display the ID, the name, the description, and the city as we specified in our query. And the next thing that I want to demonstrate is how we can list the restaurants. So this is a simple query that will call list restaurants and come back with items. That's an array of items, and from those I want to pick these fields. So let's use the docs, and now instead of using the search, I'm going to navigate using the root type. So let's navigate the query. We can see that Amplify has created all of the resolvers that will allow us to do all of the operations. So we have get restaurant, passing an ID, it will return the details for that restaurant, and we can also access the list of restaurants that we just seen. And we have some other options. We have a filter, we can also use a limit argument, and also next token. In this example, I want to use list restaurants, and I'm not going to use any of these arguments for now. Then that will return a model restaurant connection. This will allow us to do pagination, and we can see how we use the items, and also we can see how we return the list of restaurants, and we can pick the fields that we want. Alright, so let's run this second query, and now we can see that we have two items. We can also collapse the information in case we have a lot of items on the results. And finally, I want to show you how Amplify has also created filters, which are really useful. So in this case, we have the same list of restaurants query, but we are making use of the filter. For the filter, we can pick one of the fields, in this case the city, and we are going to look for restaurants that contains New York. We have seen that the list of restaurants now contains 2 restaurants. The first one is from London and the second one is from New York. So we should expect just one result. Let's run this query and we can see that we just returned one result. So it's working as expected. So here we can see that we can get some other options with options spacebar. So there's some other fields that I can use. And then for city, we can also use these other filters. But for now, we are just going to demonstrate contains. So this is pretty much it. This was all created by Amplify just by using the add model transform on our restaurants type. And that will also create all of the APIs that we can use in our client code and also in our resolvers. So now that we have created some queries and mutations, let's see how we can change our client to list the restaurants on the UI. Here I have the UI that will show the list of our restaurants. So we are using B4 and we are going through the list of our restaurants. And then for every restaurant, I'm showing the city, the name, and the description. Let's see how I did that. So the first thing that I did is I added the imports so I could access the list of restaurants. So that will be part of the generated queries, so I can access all of the queries that we saw in the console, and this will also give me access to the API and also the GraphQL operations that I want to use. So let's focus on the list restaurants. One thing that I had to do is add the restaurants array to our state, and the next thing that I did is I added this call after the user signs in, and the way I'm gonna read the information is by calling this getData method. So here we can see our call is taking the list of restaurants and making that a GraphQL operation. We are gonna use a wait, so we get the result of the response. This is a promise. You can also use a tenable, and from that we will pick the items returning from that list of restaurants. We can assign that to our state, and then what I've used is a compute function that will take that list of restaurants and that will sort them using their name. So I'm listing the results by name of the restaurant. So let's look back at how I did that on our template, and this will be how I implemented that. So I'm using the key, using the restaurant ID, so it updates when we add or remove the restaurants, and it works properly with B4 bindings, and that will get us the list of restaurants. The next thing that we can look at is how we create a new restaurant. So the first thing that we need to do is add a form, and you can see how I implemented this in this bit of the template. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna prevent the submit event using VON, and then I'm gonna use autocomplete off to remove the autocompletion coming from the browser. So that's gonna disable that behavior, and I'm gonna link all my form data with the V model. I'm going to show you right now, after looking at how I'm implementing the patterns. So this is going to create a restaurant, and that's going to call our get data if we want to refresh. We will see that this is not necessary when we are using real time, but I also put it here as an example. So let's see what are the changes that we did. For creating and deleting restaurants, we add mutations. So this will be the import to create and delete restaurants. And of course, I will need to add the form to our state. So let's see how I did that. So I'm going to move up to the create restaurant, and you can see here in this method what we are doing is we are taking the information from the restaurant, and that's coming from the form. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call create restaurant, passing that as part of the input. This is very similar to what we did in the console before, but now using the Amplify API. We are going to use a wait as we did with the previous query. And once we get the response, I'm going to use that to add to the list of restaurants. So here in this example, I'm adding it to the end of the array. And right after, I'm going to initialize, I'm going to reset the form so all of the fields are clear. So that's all for the create restaurant. The next thing I want to show you is how to introduce GraphQL subscriptions. And this is how we will be notified when a new restaurant is created by another user. So let's see that. We added this logic on the created method, and the thing that I had to import is these two, onCreateRestaurant and onDeleteRestaurant. So let's see how we use them. And on the create methods, we introduce a subscription which will be on create restaurant that will allow us to listen to notifications from any other users creating a restaurant. So those messages, those notifications will come as the source data, and that will follow the data on create restaurant as a result of that subscription. What we are going to do is we are going to check that that is a new restaurant, is a valid new restaurant, and we are going to make sure that we don't have that restaurant already. And you need to consider that when we are creating a new restaurant from our UI, it's good to send a notification to all the other users, but we will also receive that notification, so that we need to filter that. And then we're going to change the list of restaurants to include this new restaurant. We also added the same approach for when a user deletes a restaurant. So whenever a user deletes a restaurant, we will be notified, and we will just use the same approach, check that we actually have a restaurant, and we will just filter it out. So we will use the ID to filter that restaurant out and set the new restaurants array. So that's pretty much it. Let's see the UI. And this is the result from our coding. We can see we have Mamma Mia, which we created in the initial demo, and we also have the new restaurant which we created from the console. So let's demonstrate the real-time features. On the left, I have a Chrome instance, and on the right I have a Firefox instance. What I'm going to do is I'm going to interact, and for example, we can do this. We can remove a restaurant, and we can see how the Firefox instance have removed. I can do the same. So when I create a new restaurant, I can do the same, and you will see that after I create that new restaurant, the other browser gets updated. So both are always in sync. So now if I use the Firefox instance to remove the restaurant, it will also be synchronized on the Chrome instance, which is very cool. So we have seen how we created some new restaurants from the apps in console. We also created the UI, so we could create new restaurants and also delete them, while these were synchronized with all the clients in real time. So now I'm going to show you how you can publish this application and share it. And in order to do that, we're going to use another command, which is amplify add hosting, and that will allow us to publish this application live. So let's run this command. I'm going to use Amazon CloudFront and S3, and in this tutorial I'm going to use the dep option. So that will be the S3 bucket that will host my application, and I'm going to pick the index.html and also the error. And now that we have set up the hosting, we can run amplify publish. We proceed. And that's all you have to do in order to create and publish an Amplify app that will give you access to your favorite list of restaurants. If you want to follow a workshop that will give you all of these features and more, you can go to Gsand's full stack serverless Amplify UI Vue, and will give you all of the instructions step by steps to get what we have built today. And in case you need the final project, you can also find it at Gsand's full stack serverless Amplify UI Vue solution. That's all. Thank you for listening.